What is up guys, Dzeeff here. Last week I made a video about Monster Reborn and what happened to it over the years. Monster Reborn went from a staple one of in basically every single deck to a card that we only occasionally see in combo decks in the year 2022. In today's video I want to talk about Raigeki and Dark Hole. And this one's actually really fun because in that Monster Reborn video I made sort of a side comment about Raigeki being limited just because Konami wants to keep it limited rather than because of its power level, and then less than 24 hours later we got a new ban list where Raigeki went to 3 copies per deck. Raigeki and Dark Hole were both old school powerhouses that have both been banned at different points throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but these days they don't really see any play. Every once in a while you'll see a dinosaur player experiment with Dark Hole, but in reality Raigeki and Dark Hole are pretty outdated by 2022 standards. And I think today's discussion is pretty different from that Monster Reborn discussion because while Monster Reborn is limited, Dark Hole has been unlimited since July of 2019, and as of next week, Raigeki will be unlimited as well. Now before we start talking about why I don't think these cards are played in 2022 anymore, I just want to mention that if you play these cards in your deck, if you really like Raigeki and Dark Hole, there is nothing wrong with that. Don't let me stop you from playing cards that you enjoy. I am simply trying to analyze them from a more competitive perspective. Anyway, just in case you don't know what Raigeki and Dark Hole do, Raigeki and Dark Hole are both normal spell cards. Raigeki can be activated to destroy all monsters your opponent controls, while Dark Hole can be activated to destroy all monsters on the field, including your own. These cards back in the day were pretty different. Raigeki obviously is better on paper, but these days, in the way that these cards would be played theoretically, they're pretty similar actually, because if Raigeki or Dark Hole were to see play in 2022, it would almost certainly be as side deck cards that you would side deck when going second to help break boards. And in that case, you don't really care about the differences between Raigeki and Dark Hole because you wouldn't have any monsters on the field anyway if you're going second and trying to destroy your opponent's board. And that actually probably was why Konami decided to finally unlimit Raigeki. When it comes to modern Yu-Gi-Oh, these cards are basically the same. I think that there are 4 major reasons why Raigeki and Dark Hole don't see play anymore. The first one is that there are more monsters in the game right now that can't be destroyed by card effects versus back in the day. Now I will mention here that I think this part gets overstated a lot by old school players. I've read a lot of comments from people saying, oh, every modern Yu-Gi-Oh card can't be destroyed by card effects and it can't be targeted and stuff like that. That really is not true. I mean, there are certain formats where there's more cards that can't be destroyed by card effects than others. For example, back in 2019 there was a time period where Thunder Dragons and Orchist and Salamangreat were all in the format, and all 3 of those decks had cards that couldn't be destroyed by card effects. Nowadays though, like in the current format, and honestly for the past couple of formats, the majority of cards honestly can be destroyed by card effects. I don't think that problem is nearly as big as a lot of older school players might think it is. That's not to say every single old school player thinks this is a huge issue, but it's just a thing that I've noticed in my comment sections quite a bit. This is definitely an issue, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's the biggest thing holding Raigeki and Dark Hole back. For example, let's talk about the second reason these cards don't see play. This one I feel is a lot more important. A lot of modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks play cards that float when they leave the field. Float is an unofficial term, but it broadly refers to cards that have effects when they leave the field, or perhaps whenever they hit the graveyard. So if people are playing decks that have a lot of floating effects, Raigeki and Dark Hole get a lot worse. You don't really want to Raigeki your opponent's entire board of monsters only for them to trigger like 3, 4, 5 graveyard effects right afterwards. I think back to 2014 when I say this because back in Duelist Alliance format we had Shaddolls and Burning Abyss, 2 archetypes that have a ton of floating abilities. So in that format, if you were able to Raigeki or Dark Hole the opponent, you might clear their board, but they would be triggering like Skarm and Seer and Dante and Graph and stuff like that. So in those cases, if you Dark Hold the opponent, you might actually be giving them card advantage because you trigger all of their Burning Abyss or Shaddol effects. I obviously should mention here that Dark Hole was even worse against Shaddolls than it was against Burning Abyss because the Shaddol deck played Winda, which couldn't be destroyed by card effects. But overall, I think the major takeaway here is that if you're playing against a deck that has a bunch of cards that float when they leave the board, cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole aren't going to be very good. Next up, in 2022, and honestly for the last like 5 or so years, negations negations have become a lot more popular in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially compared to way back in the day when Raigeki and Dark Hole were originally released. So if you have Raigeki and Dark Hole, but your opponent has like 3 monsters on their field that can negate a spell, trap, or monster effect, obviously the Raigeki and Dark Hole are not going to make a big impact. I will mention here, when we were sort of in the transition period between the old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Days and the new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Days, Raigeki and Dark Hole weren't actually that bad, because while negation effects were becoming more popular, people didn't really end on multiple negations for cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole. I think back to years like 2012, where the Dino Rabbit deck oftentimes would only end on Logia with a bunch of back row cards, so people would commonly play cards like Dark Hole to try to bait the Logia negate, only to follow up with a Heavy Storm to get rid of all the back row. If your opponent only ends on 1 negation card, Raigeki and Dark Hole are not bad because they can bait that negation, but if your opponent ends on multiple negations, Raigeki and Dark Hole aren't going to be that valuable to you. The fourth and final reason why Raigeki and Dark Hole don't really see play anymore is that there are so many alternatives for these types of cards, and honestly those alternatives are better in many different ways. For example, if you want to compare Raigeki and Dark Hole to cards that can be used in pretty much the exact same way that you would be using Raigeki and Dark Hole, I think that Lightning Storm and Interrupted Kaiju Slumber are much better. Lightning Storm obviously does have the downside where you can't have any face-up cards when you activate it, but that doesn't really matter, because remember what I said at the beginning of the video, you want to play Raigeki and Dark Hole when you go second to help break the opponent's board. And in that case, you wouldn't have any cards on the field anyway, so you might as well just play Lightning Storm. Not to mention, in a side deck, you only have 15 spots, so by playing a card like Lightning Storm, which not only can be a Raigeki type ability, but only for face-up attack position monsters, you also have a card that could be a Harpy's Feather Duster too. So Lightning Storm can be good against decks that Raigeki would be good against, but it's also good against decks that play a lot of back row, where Raigeki and Dark Hole wouldn't be as good. When it comes to Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, this is basically just a better Dark Hole in almost every single way. So when you use it, it will destroy all monsters on the field just like Dark Hole would, but also it will summon 1 kaiju to both players' side of the field. And that might sound like a downside, but it's really not. First off, you usually will summon a smaller kaiju to the opponent's side of the field, so even if you have no other cards, you can immediately run over your opponent's kaiju. But more importantly, and honestly more commonly, you summon a kaiju to your side of the field that you could use for an Xyz summon or a Link summon or whatever. That is a really good way to not only clear the board like Dark Hole would have, but also put a big monster on your field that you can use for material. Finally, Interrupted Kaiju Slumber also has a graveyard effect that on the next turn allows you to search a kaiju, so its removal on the follow-up turn as well. Obviously that gets you a lot more value than just a Dark Hole would. But the replacements don't stop there. For example, if you played against a deck that had a lot of monsters that couldn't be destroyed by card effects, you could try playing Evenly Matched instead of Dark Hole or Raigeki. Evenly Matched would also be good against back row decks as well, so once again here, just like with the case of Lightning Storm, playing a card like Evenly Matched in your side deck is really good because you have a very limited amount of side deck spots. So a card like Evenly Matched that's good against not only monster cards but also back row is a lot more valuable than a card like Raigeki or Dark Hole that is only good against monster cards. Finally, I'll mention that if your opponent has a board full of negation effects, not only are Raigeki and Dark Hole not going to be very good, but also the Evenly Matched and Lightning Storm type cards are not going to be good either. In those cases, you might look towards cards like Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplet that don't destroy anything on the board or banish anything on the board, but they just negate a bunch of your opponent's monsters. That is a really good thing if your deck is already capable of breaking the opponent's board, but you can't play through a bunch of negations. In that case, those types of cards are way better than any actual board breaking cards because you just want to negate your opponent's cards so that you make sure your own engine works. In other words, even if you don't agree with me completely on the first 3 points, even if Raigeki and Dark Hole were theoretically okay in a format, there are so many other alternatives that they probably still wouldn't see play. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have not watched the What Happened to Monster Reborn video from a week or so ago, make sure to do that. I'll link that at the end of today's discussion. If you liked this discussion, you'll probably like that one as well. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.